After his guilty verdicts in the Chauvin trial, the family of George Floyd came out to speak to the press, and one after the other. It was interesting. They expressed gratitude to all the people who had made those verdicts possible, to the prosecutors who worked to present the case, the people who supported the family through this last terrible year. In particular, though, they all thanked Americans who protested, people who took to the streets in the weeks and months after George Floyd's death, who thereby kept George Floyd's memory alive, who kept the pressure on, who demanded justice in response to his killing. The family, one after another, credited those protests for ensuring that there would be some measure of accountability for his murder, which is why you might put it in the category of shocking but not surprising to see this headline in the New York Times, quote, GOP bills target protesters and absolve motorists who hit them. Here's the lead of the story. Here's the top of it. Quote, Republican legislators in Oklahoma and Iowa have passed bills granting immunity to drivers whose vehicles strike and injure protesters in public streets. A Republican proposal in Indiana would bar anyone convicted of unlawful assembly from holding state employment, including elected office. A Minnesota bill would prohibit those convicted of unlawful protesting from receiving student loans, unemployment benefits, or housing assistance. The measures are part of a wave of new anti-protest legislation sponsored and supported by Republicans in the 11 months since Black Lives Matter protests swept the country following the death of George Floyd. But while Democrats seized on Mr. Floyd's death last year to highlight racism and policing and other forms of social injustice, Republicans responded to a summer of protests by proposing a raft of punitive new measures governing the right to lawfully assemble. Republican lawmakers in 34 states have introduced 81 different anti-protest bills. And it is Florida, blessed Florida, that is really leading the way here. This week, on Monday, as the jury started deliberating in the Derek Chauvin trial, Florida Governor Ron DeSantis, flanked by an all-white crowd of fellow Republican officials, made Florida the first state in the nation to actually sign into law one of these bills granting immunity to drivers who drive into protesters on a road. Florida law now basically gives you a get out of lawsuits free card if you run your car into protesters, provided the people that you hit with your car were engaged in a riot at the time. Now, you may ask, what exactly does riot mean in this circumstance? When does a protest become a riot? Well, helpfully, this new bill also massively expands the definition of what it means to riot in the state of Florida. It now only takes 3 people to make a riot now in Florida. The law also creates a whole new felony category of rioting. It creates a whole new crime called mob intimidation. It makes the crime of blocking a highway a felony offense. And just for good measure, the law denies bail to arrested protesters, and it creates new protections for Confederate monuments because it wasn't on the nose enough already. Harsh new penalties for protesting, new protections for Confederate monuments. It's a felony to block a highway and immunity for drivers who plow into protesters. Florida Democrats tried in vain to stop this bill. They pointed, among other things, to the death of Heather Heyer, who was killed while protesting against the white nationalist neo-Nazi gathering in Charlottesville, Virginia in 2017. Would the neo-Nazi guy who drove his car into the protesters there and killed Heather Heyer, would he have been protected under this new law? That's terrifying, right? Which is the whole point. To make protesting feel like too much of a risk. Not only because you could be arrested and charged with a felony for all sorts of stuff that doesn't seem like a felony, but also because drivers who might be hostile to you for whatever reason or just scared of you will know they have special legal protections if they deliberately run you down with their car. A federal lawsuit filed today against Governor DeSantis and other Florida officials claims that this new law is unconstitutional for exactly that reason, because it redefines protected First Amendment speech as rioting. It uses the threat of excessive penalties to hinder free speech. We'll see if this law survives in the courts.
America is rapidly descending into a period of Jim Crow laws which are taking effect. Jim Crow were the laws that were introduced after the Tilden Hayes election in 1876, when there was almost a second civil war, when whites from the North and whites from the South almost split up again. And they cut a deal where whites from the North agreed to sacrifice the rights that had been hard won during the Civil War by blacks and allow the whites who had started the Civil War and enslaved blacks to control their environment and treat blacks the way they wanted to. It was a case of involuntary sacrifice, where white people decided to sacrifice the rights of people of African descent, of Africans in America, so they could settle their dispute among themselves. Whites have repeatedly done this in this country, dating back to Bacon's Rebellion in 1676, where whiteness was created in Virginia as a property right after a multiracial rebellion against the rich Virginia planters. That's when slavery was made permanent. That's when the American caste system based on color was established. And we've seen this repeating pattern ever since. We make progress, then we go backwards. We make progress, then we go backwards. I call it a Sisyphean cycle, taking the metaphor I take from Albert Camus' work entitled The Myth of Sisyphus. Anyway, the latest incarnations of this new Jim Crow are Republican laws around the country, not just the ones suppressing the vote, but now suppressing protest. We think we made progress with the George Floyd case. Remember last summer, there were lots of protests about the George Floyd murder by a police officer, which finally has been found by a jury to be a murder. Then the states of Florida, Indiana, and Oklahoma have brought about laws which say it's okay for a driver to run over protesters if they can claim that they were in fear of their life. This murky law is a direct violation of the First Amendment to the United States Constitution, which gives Americans the right to assemble and peaceably protest for a redress of grievances. They're aiming it at the Black Lives Matter protesters. They refuse to do anything about the insurrection in Washington, where a police officer was killed and 140 other police officers were injured, where the Congress of the U.S. was under siege. They didn't do anything about that because that was a fight among white people. But what they're doing now is sacrificing the First Amendment rights to protest of black people. This is horrendous, but this is as American as apple pie. Those of you who do not know American history need to learn it. This pattern has repeated itself so many times. I mentioned in the 1600s, before the United States was formed, when the English settlers in Virginia did it to appease poor whites. That's when they created the concept of whiteness. This happened when the Constitution was adopted in 1789, when the Senate was created. So that southern states who had smaller white populations could get 2 senators, and larger states like Pennsylvania, New York, and Massachusetts would also have 2, to give the southern whites more representation. And then they could add to that the number of indigenous Americans and African Americans who couldn't vote. African Americans would count as 3/5 of a human being for voting purposes. This was in the Constitution and was not changed until the 15th Amendment, which supposedly gave black people the right to vote. But that was not enforced after the Tilden Hayes election, as I mentioned earlier, in 1876. As I mentioned before, they gave my grandfather Latin to read after they had him explain the Constitution, which he clearly could and easily could do. This is America. This is the way America has always been. It's hard to explain this so new Americans in particular can understand it. It really is, because they've been isolated and protected. They've received the benefits of the civil rights movement of the 1960s and don't realize the struggles that we have been through since we've been here and how fragile our rights are. But you can see in the opening video, Rachel Maddow describes what is going on right now in terms of the right to protest. They want to make it so we don't have a George Floyd, because as the family said, they believed that the difference was that the protesters protested around the summer, and it was multiracial. Let's make that very clear. We're not condemning all white people. What we're condemning is white supremacy as a philosophy, as an ideology, as a political tool, which the Republican Party has been using since 1964, since the Goldwater Johnson election, when they opposed the 1964 Civil Rights Act ending segregation. And Republicans who supported it ended up leaving the party. I worked for one of them as a teenager. His name was John Lindsay, who was the Republican mayor of New York. He lost his nomination for re-election, but he was elected as a liberal on the Liberal Party line. So this has been going on now for 60 years, this movement to the right. It didn't start with Trump. Remember, Reagan ran on a states' rights platform. Reagan opposed the 1964 Civil Rights Act, ending legal segregation, which allowed we as black people and other people of color to go into supermarkets, go into stores. The anti-Asian racism goes back all the way throughout American history. Remember, there was the Anti-Chinese Immigration Act. It was illegal. Immigration reform didn't happen until 1965. It was one of the 3 major civil rights bills. The 64 Civil Rights Act, the 1965 Voting Rights Act, and the 1965 Immigration and Naturalization Reform Act, which took away the preferences for Northern Europeans and the limits on the amount of people from other areas of the world based upon where they were from and race. This is a struggle that's ongoing. We're in a period now of moving backwards. The Republican Party is driving this hard. We must fight back. As I always say, resistance is not futile. I was out in the street in the late 1960s and early 70s. I was just telling a former student of mine, I marched in the first Earth Day in 1970 in New York City. Gosh, I can't believe that was 50 years ago. But My point to you guys is that we have to fight to maintain our rights as Americans. The First Amendment is under direct attack. The Republicans want it only for white people. That's what the law in Florida is about. That's what the law in Oklahoma is about. That's what the law in Indiana is. They want to limit the vote for people of color. That's what the law in Georgia is about. That's what the law in Arizona that they were trying to pass is about. There are, 46 now, I believe, pieces of legislation the Republicans are putting forward across the nation to restrict voting. This is the way Jim Crow was initially put into place. A lot of people do not understand American history. They don't study American history. You need to learn so you will understand what's going on, particularly young people. This is not a passing fancy. This has been the way America has been a majority of its history. America has never been land of the free and home of the brave. Hit the like button if you like this video and subscribe to this channel to receive more truth-telling like this in the future. Have a good day.